In Britain today, we are surrounded by the remnants of the British Empire. The legacies of colonialism and slavery are evident in our public spaces through monuments and museums, as well as in our education system through the national curriculum. But beyond these constant reminders, the legacy of imperialism can also be felt in the way the British government treats its citizens, and in particular, British citizens of colour. The history of Black Britain starts long before 1948, with hundreds of years of imperialism and slavery, but the moment that lives in popular memory as the beginning of a Black British population is the arrival of the Empire Windrush. Though Black British history does not start with the docking of the Empire Windrush, the event certainly represents a landmark change in how Britain viewed her imperial subjects. On the 22nd of June 1948, Empire Windrush arrived at Tilbury Docks, bringing 492 hopeful West Indians to their new home in the mother country. The event attracted attention from the media, with news reporters describing the migrants as many ex-servicemen who had served the country well, who were now coming to Britain, full of hope, to find work that could not be found in the Caribbean. News reporters met the new arrivals at the docks, interviewing them about their aspirations. When asked why he has come to England, one arrival states simply that he is here to seek a job of any type, so long as it is paid well. The West Indians are painted as grateful British subjects, thankful for any opportunities the great mother country might afford them. The news footage describes Lord Kitchener as singing his thanks to Britain as he recites "London is the place for me" from on board the ship. The citizenship status of these new arrivals, and all subsequent West Indians deemed part of the Windrush generation, was a result of the 1948 British Nationality Act. The new act came into effect on January 1, 1949, creating a new political entity, the United Kingdom and Colonies, whose residents shared a common citizenship. The Act was influenced by the passage of the Canadian Nationality Act of 1946, under which British subjecthood became a derivative of Canadian citizenship. Concerned about the strength of its empire, British Parliament looked for a way to strengthen the sense of imperial nationality. In theory, the terms of the Act united all British subjects, transcending social divisions marked by race, ethnicity, and class. However, the reality of the Act did not live up to these ideals. Those from the colonies who fell under this Act were granted full privileges and entitlements, which included the right to work and permanently settle in Britain. But this did not mean there was one homogeneous idea of British identity. Many in the Caribbean had grown up with a strong sense of British identity. As one migrant recalled, "We were British. England was our mother country. We were brought up to respect the royal family. We grew up British." However, those in the metropole had a very different idea of what constituted being British. Ultimately, to many, being British meant being white. Whilst the newspapers read "Welcome Home," behind the scenes, the mood in Parliament was less than celebratory. As migrant Sam King has noted, "They didn't want us. They were trying to find a way in Parliament to stop us, but legally they could not." Quite frankly, the government deemed Windrush an embarrassment and immediately sought to stop any further mass migration from taking place. Minister of Labour George Isaacs expressed how he hoped no encouragement would be given to others to follow their example. On the day of the Windrush's arrival, 11 Labour MPs sent a letter to Prime Minister Clement Attlee requesting that he put in place controls to limit black migration to Britain. They were concerned that an influx of coloured people was likely to impair the harmony, strength, and cohesion of our people and social life. Though clearly unwelcome by the government, these West Indians were here to stay and determined to carve out a life for themselves in the metropole. Whilst the terms of the 1948 Nationality Act granted all British subjects the right to work and permanently settle in Britain, employment and housing proved to be challenging areas for West Indian migrants. With a lack of economic opportunity in the Caribbean, many West Indians looked to Britain with the hopes that their British subjecthood would provide them with the jobs they had been promised. Britain was desperate to rebuild after the devastation of World War II, and the country was facing severe labour shortages. An economic survey in 1946 projected labour shortages of between 600,000 and 1.3 million. In order to alleviate their situation and meet these labour demands, Britain ran various schemes to recruit labour from Europe. By 1950, the Polish Resettlement Corps had brought 120,000 Polish veterans and their families to Britain with plans for permanent resettlement, and the Westward Ho initiative had recruited over 78,000 people from displacement camps in Austria and Germany. These workers also received permanent settlement and became known as European volunteer workers. As historian Kennetta Hammond has noted, at the same time that the government actively supported and sponsored the immigration of foreign labour from continental Europe, officials expressed serious reservations about the prospect of recruiting colonial workers, though they were legally British citizens, to address deficiencies in the post-war domestic labour market. Clearly, the issue was not with the number of bodies migrating into the country, but with the colour of them. The government actively attempted to suppress increasing migration to Britain from the Caribbean through the distribution of Before You Go to Britain pamphlets, cautioning prospective migrants of significant job competition between them and long-standing residents of Britain. There were, however, also examples of the government actively recruiting colonial labour where they needed it. In the early 1950s, the government sought to recruit labourers to work in some of the key sectors of expansion in the post-war welfare state, including hospitals, domestic service industries, and the London Transport Executive. Many women served the NHS, training as nurses, whilst men often worked in the construction and transport industries. Though many West Indians possessed valuable employable skills, often they were de-skilled upon finding a job in the UK. Almost 65% of male migrants were classified at the time of their departure as skilled or semi-skilled workers, occupying such positions as carpenters, mechanics, and painters. However, upon arriving in Britain, many occupied positions of a lower rank than they would have in their homeland. Even within these lower-ranked positions, they still faced racial discrimination from their white co-workers and employers. Black workers faced derogatory racial stereotypes about their abilities as workers, and were labelled by their employers as slow, lazy, and irresponsible compared to their white counterparts. These stereotypes were used to justify informal quotas in the hiring of black workers, as well as casting them as better suited to lower paid and non-professional work. Alongside the discrimination they faced in finding employment, many West Indian migrants also struggled to find accommodation. Up against the informal colour bar, their housing options were limited. One migrant, May Cambridge, who migrated during the 1950s, recalled, "The no Irish, blacks or dogs signs are no myth. Sometimes you would knock on the door with a vacant sign on the window. Some would say the room had just gone, others would slam the door in your face." The extent of the colour bar can be seen in the number of newspaper housing advertisements which barred would-be tenants on the basis of race. Between November 1958 and January 1959, the Kensington Post contained over 300 housing ads either specifically excluding persons of colour or specifying Europeans or English only. Even when migrants could find housing that they were allowed to occupy, they were often subject to poor living conditions. Migrants have recalled how they were living in houses with no baths, having to share one toilet with numerous other residents, and all while under the watchful eye of suspicious landlords who imposed strict curfews and regulations on their tenants. Due to the informal colour bar, migrants were often subject to exploitation, taking inadequate housing wherever they could find it, and paying higher than average rental fees for it, commonly described as a colour tax. The impact of this restrictive housing system was a concentration of West Indian migrants in certain areas of major cities, such as Notting Hill and Brixton in London. As the government labelled black migration as the cause of Britain's social tensions within the employment and housing sectors, they also looked to the restriction of this Commonwealth migration as their solution. The Commonwealth Immigration Act of 1962 was initially introduced by Conservative Home Secretary R.A. Butler. At first glance, the Act appeared to be a race-neutral policy, regulating the entrance of Commonwealth citizens on the basis of their employment prospects. However, the bill sparked much debate around its true character, with politicians and public alike seeing through to its racist core. Discussion around immigration restrictions took place long before this bill was eventually enacted, the peak of debate occurring between 1954 and 1955. To the bitter disappointment of the cabinet members, however, the geopolitical landscape was not ready for such overtly racist regulations. Britain's international reputation was of top priority, and any policy that could be perceived as racially discriminatory was cause for concern for Britain's global position. As Commonwealth Relations Secretary, Lord Swinton had cautioned, though the policy could be drafted in non-discriminatory terms, it could not conceal the obvious fact that the object is to keep out coloured people. By 1961, however, the political climate had changed. In the aftermath of the racial violence that occurred in Nottingham and Notting Hill in 1958, immigration became a racialised political discourse, and black men were blamed for the anxieties of white working-class men regarding the availability of jobs, decent housing, and even sexual partners. Following these events, a Gallup poll reported that almost 80% of those asked supported imposing restrictions on immigration from the Commonwealth. Despite this public support, there was dissent from black British activists, as well as from various MPs. Many saw the policy for what it was, a colour bar bill. With the exemption of Irish migrants, and with the British government looking to agree to freedom of movement from Europe as part of their European Economic Community application, it was clear that the policy was aimed very directly at people of colour. Regardless of this opposition and overt racial discrimination, the bill was passed. Not only did the bill restrict immigration from the Commonwealth based on the possession of employment vouchers, it also gave the Home Office unprecedented powers of deportation. Any Commonwealth citizen who had been convicted of a serious criminal offence, who had been residing in Britain for less than 5 years, was at risk of deportation. 22-year-old Carmen Bryan is just one example of someone falling victim to this part of the bill, being deported for her serious criminal offence of petty theft, the goods taken totalling to approximately £2. On top of this threat of deportation, migrants also now faced further discrimination from landlords due to a particular subsection of the bill that made it a criminal offence for any person to knowingly harbour an undocumented immigrant or someone in violation of any other provisions of the bill. This hostile environment would be reflected decades later, once again due to instruction from the government to be on the lookout for any undocumented persons. Following the 1962 Act, there were further immigration acts in 1968 and 1971, each increasing the restrictions on migrants and removing the last remnants of the rights of entry that had been granted by the 1948 British Nationality Act. In 1965, the Race Relations Act outlawed discrimination on the grounds of race and made incitement to racial hatred a criminal offence. 3 years later, however, Enoch Powell made his infamous Rivers of Blood speech. Powell asserted that the children of migrants would never be British, claiming that the West Indian or Asian does not, by being born in England, become an Englishman. Though he was sacked from his shadow cabinet position, Powell received thousands of letters of support from the public, and 74% of those questioned in a Gallup poll agreed with his statements. Though the government introduced race relations acts to outlaw racial discrimination over the next few years, it was clear that the damage by the political elite had already been done, and ill will towards migrants was not going anywhere. In 2012, the opening ceremony of the London Summer Olympics put on a grand display of Britain's history. The ceremony featured everything that makes Britain a proud nation, including a display of the Empire Windrush. The same year, British Home Secretary Theresa May set out her strategy to create a hostile environment for illegal migration in Britain. The direct result of this policy was devastation to many families descended from the Windrush generation. May's hostile environment meant that migrants faced border officials as a constant part of daily life. They were being asked to prove their immigration status at every turn, whether it be to rent a property or to access the health services. The result of the Immigration Acts of 2014 and 2016 were to turn landlords and doctors into border control. The policy increased discrimination in housing, with landlords disproportionately carrying out checks on black and ethnic minority people for fear of incurring penalties. The right to rent scheme introduced in 2016 was criticised as unlawful and discriminatory, as it forced landlords to deny tenancy to anyone who could not prove their immigration status. The hostile environment also had detrimental effects on people's health, as many were denied urgent health care. One such case includes a man who had lived in the UK for over 40 years, who had come to Britain as part of the Windrush generation. He was denied free cancer treatment as a result of being refused leave to remain in the UK in 2015. The hostile environment produced many more stories like this for the Windrush generation. Many had come to Britain as children, arriving on their parents' passports, and the Home Office also destroyed thousands of landing cards and other records, meaning many lacked the documentation to prove their right to live in the UK. As stated in the Immigration Act of 1971, the burden of proof fell on the individuals making the appeals. The proof required to satisfy the Home Office was at least one official document from every year they had lived in Britain. Finding documents spanning back decades proved to be, in many cases, an impossible task. As a result, many British citizens were falsely labelled illegal immigrants or undocumented migrants, and lost access to housing, healthcare, and other rights they had been afforded as British citizens. Many were placed in immigration detention, prevented from travelling abroad, and even deported to countries they barely recognised. Whilst the government reported that more than 160 members of the Windrush generation may have been wrongly detained or deported, there have been over 1,270 claims made to a compensation scheme. The treatment of these British citizens has been appalling, and yet it is nothing new. The discrimination that the Windrush generation faced as a direct result of government policies can be seen spanning the decades. The assumption that British means white has always had an antithesis, that black means immigrant. The decision that the government made in 1948 to treat West Indians as unwelcome, second-class citizens in a country they had been taught was their home has influenced decades of public opinion on the issues of immigration and race relations. The hostile environment created by the 1962 Commonwealth Immigration Act can be seen to resurface decades later as official policy, once again to the detriment of many black British citizens. The stance of the political elite has the power to influence the people they lead. Whether it be chants of "Keep Britain White" or people being shouted at on the streets to go back to your own country, the government has an important role to play to ensure that it is dismantling institutional racism rather than encouraging it.